Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Gene Alloway, the proprietor of the famed used and rare bookstore Mott and Bailey here in Ann Arbor. Welcome to Rip Rap, Gene.
Thank you.
I think you already know my fondness for this store, and the two of us have had some fascinating discussions on a wide range of topics over the years. I wanted to do this interview so I could learn even more about you and the role of academic literature in your life. So, for example, what is your personal history with academic books?
Well, I came from a small town in Kansas that had no bookstore whatsoever.
Oh,
And the owner of the grocery store had a little gift shop, and she had some paperbacks there. So I basically read paperbacks. And of course, we went to our library, public library. But when I went into college, my background was in classics. And so you can't avoid academic books and classics. And even today, classics majors of all the undergraduate degrees generally have bigger libraries than almost every other undergraduate degrees, except maybe English majors. But I even ran a library out of my dorm room, the H. Beam Piper Memorial Library and Reading Room. He was a science fiction writer I liked, and I still have my library card that we created for other guys in the scholarship hall, is what it was called. But then I, became a librarian and an academic librarian, and then again, there they are.
well, why did you decide to become a librarian?
I majored in classics, as I said, but my Greek was so terrible I knew I couldn't continue because I wanted to go into Byzantine history. And my Latin was much better, but the Byzantines didn't speak much Latin. They were Greek. So,
You have some books here.
yeah. These are books that I find interesting, but one of them is actually going to be mine, but the other ones I just love to get in the shop. Well, you see those. An individual book is an artifact of that, but a collection of books from a person, and the way they're put together, is almost a resonance of that person, more than an artifact. It has something beyond itself. The sheer collection is saying something, and more than the sum of the parts. And that's something you can't, as a bookstore, you can't keep them together, but you sort of have a privilege of seeing that for the last time, and before they're broken up.
You have some books here.
Yeah. These are books that I find interesting, but one of them is actually going to be mine, but the other ones I just love to get in the shop. But at the same time, you've got libraries robbing their monograph budgets to buy electronic journals. So they're buying fewer books. So what might have been printed in 800 or 500 copies in the past is now at the 300 or 200 level. And so, yeah, they're more expensive. And unless
fewer pages.
A few pages. Well, some. But then the production gets bad. I mean, I picked up a book from the University of Kentucky Press. It was sort of printed in the case had been clearly just put on. There was no rounded back. It was a flat back. Instead of putting it in soft cover, they just threw a hardcover case on it. Didn't look very good, and I don't think it's a very good job of binding. And it was very disappointing to see that from Kentucky, because they usually do better work than that. And the book cost more than this book on Napoleon, which is completely cloth bound. Theirs was printed covers. It wasn't even cloth at all. The cover was printed right on the book, like a print-on-demand book. And this is nice, heavy paper, definitely twice as heavy as the other book that's just as thick that I got from Kentucky. So there are certain pressures that I think our university presses are dealing with. Some of the books are not going to go into paperback if they're not picked up by a class. So you've got to get all their money off that hardcover. And I'm crazy enough to spend $60, $70 or $80, from Dartmouth for a particular book in hardcover. But there's not many people like me around. And,
Well, if they take too many shortcuts, that shortens the longevity of that book.
oh, it certainly does. I mean, I personally don't. I think the quality of the book I have, I don't think the binding's going to last. I'm already thinking about who would have rebind it. And whereas any of these 3 books I brought here, all published within the last 10 years, they're fine books. No, they're not cheap. But one trick I do is I get on the mailing list of the publishers, and several times a year they'll have coupons or sales that'll be better than Amazon, even with shipping that you have to pay from the publisher. So even if you have Prime, you'll still get a better deal by buying directly from the press. And sometimes, in the case of some of these books, Amazon will only get 4 or 5 copies, and then they're done. They won't get any more because the print run's so small. So if you really work directly with the source, you'll get the book cheaper, and you won't have to come to me 5 years later and pay twice as much for it. And I tell many of my customers this. The corollary of that is sort of the fact that bookstores aren't carrying University Press books. I told you I came from a town that didn't have any good bookstores. Well, the University of Kansas didn't really have. I mean, the University of Kansas bookstore was the only place you could buy academic books at a store there. The new bookstores in town were not that great. There was a really good academic used bookstore called J. Hood, which now still exists but sells online. But when I got to Ann Arbor and I walked in the Borders, the angels sang. I mean, they had new arrivals of University Press books. And I was in heaven. And that has completely colored my view of what a bookstore could be. And no, I don't think we can necessarily exactly be a big bookstore like Borders. One could be, but I think you could be close to it in town. You just have to think a little differently than they did in the late 80s, early 90s. But you certainly have to think differently than new bookstores are doing now. I think they're too reliant on author appearances.
Well, and there does seem to be some kind of evolution happening with bookstores even in Ann Arbor.
But for instance, we just finished the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Fantastic books, affordably priced. Illinois, Kentucky, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kansas, Illinois, Massachusetts, coming out with these great books. And new bookstores not carrying them. And I'm not God's gift to book selling, but I can move those books. I move books in the same price range all the time. And none of the bookstores in town, in this academic town, were carrying University Press Civil War titles that were priced for bookstores because they're priced at all the shops at the battlefields and stuff too. So they're appealing to a mass audience. Not here. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's a sad mistake that new bookstores are making. They're too focused on the bestsellers and the hyped books and
the brand names.
The fiction. To be blunt, just the fiction, because the authors will show up in many cases. And I don't have anything against fiction, but it's not the only game in town.
Well, and there's the Barnes and Noble.
You mean the Lego store? I mean,
I don't even go in there anymore because there's just not much that I'm interested in.
Well, one of the reasons I left the library is because I felt the library forgot who it was. And one of the things I worry about Barnes & Noble and some of these other stores are they're forgetting what a bookstore is. One of the things I love to read is bookseller memoirs and interviews with booksellers. And the way I look at it is if you survived the Depression, read that guy's memoir. He's a bookseller and he survived the Depression in the heart of New York City. That guy's got something to say and you've got something to learn. And so it's fun to see how other booksellers have handled these challenges and sold whatever type of books, whether they're high-end, fine press books, whether they're early paperbacks or Penguins, or if they are a scholarly bookstore or poetry bookshop, whatever. You can always learn something.
We had talked earlier about the entrepreneur thing, and that certainly is front and center when you're selling books. You got to know what you're doing with your product in that market.
Well, there are affordances. You can go some distance not knowing what you're doing. But the other thing I tell people is in books, one of the reasons I love it is because you are rewarded for what you know and you're punished for what you don't, and you have an opportunity to learn every day. And there's not many jobs you can say that about. And sometimes if you want to learn, there's an opportunity to learn every day, whether it's from customers, whether it's from lists of awards coming out, looking for obscure awards, whether it's from just reading a publisher's mail blast of what they're coming out with this season. Because some of these new books are what you're going to be seeing 2 or 3 years down the road as a used bookstore. So I like to be aware of it. And also I like to recommend books to my customers even if I don't have them. And that's the librarian in me, So
So you think the book industry can survive?
yeah, I think it can.
They have to adapt, but
Well, I think it can adapt, but one of the things is creative destruction. You know that phrase that comes up sometimes. They have to. What's that phrase now? Disrupt the system or whatever. But it's stupid to forget what worked all along. One of the things is there's certain things new bookstores do well. There's certain things used bookstores do well, and they can learn from each other. And I think used bookstores can learn a lot more from new bookstores than the other way around. But there's certain things that work and have worked for decades and still work. A mailing list, contacting customers. When a book comes in, contact them. Don't throw it up on the web. Don't just put it on your shelf and hope the guy comes in. Don't bug him with every little thing that comes in. But if something's dead on, you got a customer for life if you get him the right book. So I think sometimes people forget in the rush to the new. They forget what has always worked. Facing books out like I have on the shelves here. I didn't innovate that. I mean, nobody buys Captain Crunch from the spine. They look for the captain on the front, and these publishers have done, great work on these dust jackets. It helps sell the book. And many new bookstores, they shove them in like this, spine out everywhere. But, that's not how book buying works.
it's the personal relationship.
Personal relationship, but one of the things, some of these books, Hemingway's neglected short fiction Behind You by Beagle. I mean, I've had that book twice before. That's a seller. I mean, you wouldn't think. But title for someone that likes Hemingway. And again, I don't have to do any more than face it out. And it's because the author and the publisher and the designer have done their job. Now it's my job to either mention it to somebody who's looking for Hemingway as something they might have overlooked, or to just get them to look at it, to expose
Why
them
do
to
you
something
think people
different.
like that book?
Because well, first off, I think more people know his longer work than his shorter work. And you're looking at a subset of his short work. What are his neglected works? Why are they neglected? What does this person have to say about that? And again, many people who are into a particular author, especially 20th century authors, whether it's Kerouac or Ginsberg or Hemingway or Faulkner, whoever, they really get into them. And so another big seller from academic presses is any books about the library of an author. Well, those fly out of here. Just fly out of here. Because they want to know what books were on his shelf or her shelf. And people love those sort of
That's
books.
just like the 800 books from that other woman.
Exactly right.
It tells a lot about the person.
Yeah. And especially if you can go to a library and see annotations in there. Sometimes even the books talk about the annotations. So, again, it's not that this will sell in 6 months, but over a 3-year period, I'll sell 3. You just have to be patient. You're on a longer timeline than a new bookstore.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap. It's been quite an interesting discussion.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to talk books. I talk people's ear off in the store all the time. I have to be careful I don't get them parking tickets.
Thank you, Gene.
Buying the entire thing, even though a couple were interested, and I sold a couple items to them each. But it's very difficult to keep a collection together like that.
Well, and there's a respect for the passion,
Right.
for the motivation to do something like that. It's really quite magnificent.
Yeah, and what some people don't realize is if you do give to a library these days, chances are they're going to break it up anyway, unless you give an awful lot of money with those books.
You have some books here.
Yeah. These are books that I find interesting, but one of them is actually going to be mine, but the other ones I just love to get in the shop. This is from Princeton, Stalinist Science, and that's very interesting to me because it's much more politically laden. I mean, not to say American science isn't, but here it's ideology. It's oppressive. 5-year plans and things like that. So it's very interesting. And Princeton did a fantastic job with this, and it's highly thought of. And
The author is.
yeah, and the book as well.
I'm trying to get you to say the name of the author.
The author is Nikolai Kremetsov, and he is senior researcher at the History of Science at St. Petersburg, Institute of History of Science. And what I liked about this book was it's at a really good period between the fall of '97. So before, after the fall of the Soviet Union, but before Putin basically tries to turn it back into a czarship, So a really nice book from the Russians about their science, and Princeton, they have some strong history of science credentials. This book is very recent from Cambridge, quite a bit of heft, as I like. It's on Napoleon, the Franco-Prussian War of 1813. This is volume 2 of it. Michael Legier, who's an up-and-coming scholar. That's the other thing that's fun is either the person in the shop or sometimes just being on a mailing list of a university press. You get to see these new scholars just do amazing stuff, and you can either see how they've built on somebody else or corrected somebody else or just added to the conversation in some way. And they always they find these nooks and crannies that people have overlooked, and he's definitely one of them. I love his work.
And changing the notion of who Napoleon was.
Right. What it does is he's not clouded by either love or hate of Napoleon. So he uncovers some new strengths of Napoleon while at the same time also showing some of the weaknesses of the Napoleonic system, and in certain times his arrogance in the face of coalitions. And this other book here, this is from Boydell. Boydell, I don't know if it's still Boydell and Brewer. This is just Boydell. Anglo-Norman Castles, edited by Robert Lydiard. This is a collection of articles. And my one gripe with some university press books when there are anthologies of scholarly work like this is the title is very tangential to some of the articles that are in there. This is not the case with this particular book. It's nicely focused, and sometimes it can be a bit of a reach on some of the books. But we love medieval history here. Motte and Bailey is, of course, a type of Anglo-Norman castle itself. And so we do love medieval history. But Boydell is a good example, like Four Courts out of Dublin, of these small foreign publishers who are picking up the slack. There's nothing quite like them here in the States anymore. And that's a shame. But they do some really, really outstanding scholarly stuff. And they, again, cover niches that occasionally a trade press used to do, or even some university presses here, but just don't do anymore.
I must confess I have a fascination for castles.
Well,
And there's a lot of them in this country,
Yes.
and I've got a book on American castles, but there's one in Death Valley, for example.
There's one over here on the northwest side of town. Someone's made a facade on front of their house. That's a castle. It's fun to look at Christmas.
It's just, these huge constructions. There's one in the was it Lawrence River? They're all over the place in this country, which I find, quite an anomaly. That there'd be castles in a country that was against royalty and that kind of construction.
Well, I think that's partly bookish too. There's this revival, partly led by William Morris in the 1890s, for medieval craft. And it wouldn't surprise me if you looked at some of these buildings that they're from 1870s up. And in some cases, it might have even been Robert Burns that inspired somebody. But there's an interesting relationship between this medievalist movement out of the late 1800s and architecture in both America and England. This romanticized view of the Middle Ages, which you see in some books. Illustrated by Howard Pyle, for instance. Pirates and Knights, 1890 to 1910.
Well, one book I've got talks about castles in Britain and how they went around and destroyed at least one side of it, so it couldn't be used as a fortress.
Yep.
Because they were a little concerned about the Lord and
Oh yeah.
setting up a fortress.
That was a big no-no if they didn't have permission to do so.
One of the things that, as I reflected on this interview, is that how the dynamics of academic book publishing industry and its existence in increasingly digital reality. What do you see as its long-term future?
Well, I think digital's proven itself another format, but not in all cases one that replaces the book in any way. Certain disciplines have gravitated more toward digital than others. I think, except for history of science type things, if you're in physics or chemistry, you're really not reading books. You're reading articles. You're often using digital references and stuff. And it's just the nature of the beast, And but it doesn't mean that those people who are chemists and physicists or doctors or whatever don't read other things, and they still like books on the history of their discipline or biographies of important people or important discoveries in their field. So I think, and I think they do like the book, and I also think the students prefer a book in those sort of instances. In fact, a number of students, when they're reading a lot of text rather than, say, a more technical textbook. A number of studies have shown, one fairly recently, that they prefer a book because there's less distractions. They can focus more. Because if they're looking at it on their iPad or even their computer, then they're much more connected. So there's dings from their social network. There's instant messages from their messenger that's up, for instance, or their emails dinging with stuff. And so, and they may just, someone may say something to them and say, oh, I'm right here, I'll just look up what the movie times are. So students have actively said, when I really need to study, I steer away from the digital. It's just too distracting.
And it lasts longer, because the software keeps evolving.
Oh, yeah.
And so something you saved 10 years ago, you can't even access now.
Right. And that's what I tell people with digital libraries is, the jury's still out on whether Amazon's going to be here in 10 years. They're not making much of a profit. And eventually, the marketplace is going to learn how to deal with them better. And we're still going to have bookstores. So if you're on a proprietary format, and that proprietary format goes belly up, how do you access your library in 20 years? And I think that's why for most electronic books, it's short-term use. Textbooks, genre novels, sometimes poetry. But we've had young people who have read part of an electronic book, either because of the poor design of the electronic book or the fact they liked it so much, they have sought out a print copy because it mattered to them in some way, either for use or for personal meaning.
Plus, they need someone like you to help extend this relationship and in the interaction with the text.
Right, and
But you talked about the research you do and the interaction that you have and how you can enhance that.
right. Well, or I can just share it if I don't do it myself. And share someone else's ideas and suggestions. I mean, what another thing I tell folks is even if you're Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or even the Koch brothers, if they read, Koch brothers, sorry, if they have the biggest house in the world, they still don't have the time, you know. And so nobody has the time or the money or the space or some combination of those to read every book they want. No one in the world. So one thing being a librarian has taught me, and in looking especially at the nonfiction stuff, is what are the better books? What are they? Who's saying they are the better books? Who else is saying that? Who else is saying these other books are the better books? And to help people think more critically about what they're reading in terms of what am I going to read. So maybe this is superseded, but I'm reading it for a different reason, and that's okay. But I know it's superseded. Or I'm reading this and I don't agree with it, but I know I still need to read it. And those are very different reasons than why you read the latest Ann Patchett. You know.
It's the discourse.
Yes.
It's what people are thinking and talking and writing about and trying to understand their existence.
Right. And sure, you can get some of that from novels, but you can get some of that from books. And some of it you just don't even see coming. If I can relate an anecdote, I was reading a book on the military revolution of the 17th century by Geoffrey Parker. And he just threw off something, paragraph, moved on, and I was just gobsmacked me. And that is with the Spanish Armada. When you think of a naval fight, right? You think of Errol Flynn or whatever. The cannons are on the ship and they fire and they rocket back from the recoil and they fill them up again and roll them out the side of the ship. The Spanish didn't have wheels on the back half of their guns. They didn't do that. They literally threw lambskin, wool, over the barrel of the gun on the outside of the ship. And the guy sat on the barrel. And the men on the ship handed him the shot and powder to load them. And this went on until the early 1600s.
Talk about a hot seat.
And so the British not only had the biggest guns when fighting, the biggest ships fighting the Spanish Armada. 3 of the British ships were bigger than anything the Spanish had. Their rate of fire was 3 times as much. So the Spanish didn't have much of a chance at all.